This video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you need a website or domain, visit squarespace.com. Hey everybody, and welcome back to a new video. Have you been told that real photographers shoot in manual and the other modes are for noobs and amateurs? In this video, I'm going to show you that's not true, and I'm going to show you two modes that in many situations are better than manual. If you stay till the end, I'll show you the mode that I use to take photos like this, this, and this. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for wildlife and nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. Okay, let's start off with a quick look at the mode dial. On most cameras, you can change how the camera operates to change the three main settings that affect your photo's brightness: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, by turning this dial to switch between modes. Most people can guess how A for automatic works. It sets all the settings for you. This can work, but it doesn't know if you want the background in focus or blurry, or how fast your subject is moving. As such, it may make some mistakes. At the other extreme is manual. This is where you set all three main parameters on your own. While this does provide the maximum of control and is excellent in some scenarios, that doesn't mean it's better. Now, why is that? While manual is very precise, it's best used when the lighting is controlled or consistent in every direction, maybe like a studio, or you have lots of time to set up your shot. I use manual in landscape photography or Milky Way photography, as I can take my time and get the settings I want, and the light is very consistent as I'm often pointing in the same direction for several photos. But these situations of controlled lighting or having all the time in the world are actually a very small part of photography. The great majority of photography is done while walking around or looking for shots or moving around your subjects or your subjects around you, like portraits or wildlife, or even your kids' sports, with sun in one direction and shade in the other. In manual, every time the light changes, you need to change your settings to get the exposure right. If I shoot this camera in manual out the window and then indoors using the same settings, there's a problem. The same settings won't work with the two scenes with different amounts of light, as they need different settings to get the shot right. That means in manual, you're always playing with the settings while out doing photography. A partly cloudy day is a prime example of when manual is a pain. I go out to shoot wildlife, and every time the sun goes in and out, I'm playing with the settings. And that is taking you away from the creative process of focusing on more important things like composition and technique, and for me, finding wildlife. Wouldn't it be nice to have the camera take care of some of this for you, but not making the same mistakes as the automatic mode? To the rescue are semi-automatic modes, shutter and aperture priority. Aperture priority, A or AV on your mode dial, is the mode to use where setting the aperture is the most important setting for the photographer, and it's okay to let the camera set the shutter speed to get the exposure right. Set the ISO accordingly for the lighting conditions, low in good light and higher in low light, or even in automatic, and set the aperture to the desired F number. The camera then automatically sets the shutter speed to the speed needed to balance the exposure. That is, to get the brightness of the photo to be shown as 0 on the light meter, what's known as medium or 18% gray, a gray that reflects 18% of light. This is the mode of choice for those people who shoot genres where the aperture is the most important setting for them, like still life, portraits, street photography, and people. This is because in these genres, having the lens wide open to get a nice blurry and smooth background is often seen as desirable, and in aperture priority, you can set that aperture, but don't really care what the shutter speed is. Let's look at this scene. I'll pick the ISO for the light, in this case I'll pick ISO 1000. Now I pick the aperture to get the background blurry, so I use a wide aperture, a small f number like f2. And see, as I change the aperture, the camera keeps the exposure constant at 0 on the light meter by adjusting the shutter speed, which in this scenario isn't a critical setting. I can even add or remove light as if the scenario is changing or the sun is coming up from behind the clouds, and the shutter speed is adjusted to keep the exposure right, and it can do this in fractions of a second. Just keep shooting. Now, if we're going to spend all this effort to get the best image quality out of our photos, don't we owe it to them to show them off at their best? That's where a website comes in, and a great time to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. As many social media platforms move more and more into video as a trend rather than photography, I think having a website is more important than ever. We need a place where we can showcase our work in fine detail, rather than the small thumbnails which don't show off all the work that went into a photo, or is favoring video over your photos. I built my very own website using Squarespace and it was a breeze. They have lots of templates for you to choose from, and even templates designed for certain genres, like photography. If you want to get even more creative, you can go outside the templates and design your own pages from scratch, with tools for adding text, video clips, photos, and links to other parts of your website. Not only is this a great way to display your work, you can even monetize it with your own online store, and you can take payments via credit card or PayPal from all over the world. Head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Simon to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. But let's say you shoot in a genre or situation where the shutter speed is the most important setting. That's where shutter priority comes in, S or TV for time value on your camera. Action, sports, motorsports, and wildlife are genres where having enough shutter speed to freeze the movement of your subject is critical. Or maybe you want a slow shutter speed on purpose for artistic movement in the shot, like water in a waterfall. For these, the shutter speed is critical, but maybe the aperture isn't. In these scenarios, set the ISO to what you want, and then you only have one setting to worry about, shutter speed. Move it up when you need more, less when you need less. And ta-da! The camera will adjust the aperture to get the exposure right. Note that on some cameras, the buttons of what is controlled where may change in the different modes. On my Canon camera, the dial by the shutter button is the main dial for both modes. When I use shutter priority, it controls the shutter speed, but when in aperture priority, it controls the aperture. You can customize this differently if you want. In my case, I like the same dials to control the same settings, regardless of the mode I'm using. In these modes, if you happen to notice a blinking setting on your back LCD, it means that the camera can't keep adjusting the setting to balance the exposure. For example, lenses have a minimum and maximum aperture, so once you hit those, your camera can't go any further. On some camera brands, it won't let you change the settings further. On others, it may let you continue to change the settings but leave you under or overexposed. I once had a student from a wildlife photography course email me in a panic from I think it was Panama, as her camera wasn't obeying her settings commands, and she was heading out into the jungle soon and wouldn't have a means to get in touch. We spoke on the phone and I figured out that this was the issue. In these scenarios, see if you can change the ISO or one of the other settings to allow the camera to get the exposure right. Now, what do you do in these modes if the image is still too bright or too dark? Remember, the camera is trying to get the exposure to be middle gray, and while it usually will do a very good job, it won't always get it right. That's where exposure compensation comes in. In semi-automatic modes, you adjust the exposure, brighter by moving the light meter's indicator to the right, darker to the left. Use this to get the exposure just right in case the camera's choice isn't perfect. Remember that the parameter that the exposure compensation will change to change the exposure is the one you're letting the camera manage. So exposure compensation will adjust aperture in shutter priority, but will adjust shutter speed in aperture priority. See here in aperture priority, the exposure compensation dial changes the shutter speed to make the image brighter or darker. So make sure you have exposure compensation on a handy dial if you have a spare dial on your camera, either a top dial or the thumb dial. On many cameras, you can customize this to your liking. If you don't have any spare dials, look for this icon next to a light meter on your back LCD or even on the top LCD. Now an extra trick from the pros. When using aperture and shutter priority, there may be minimum and maximum settings that you don't want to surpass. For example, in aperture priority, you may be fine letting the camera pick the shutter speed, except you never want it to go under a certain threshold to make sure your handheld photos are sharp. In a dark venue, your shutter speed may go down to 1/10 or even 1 second. That's no good handheld. What do? Many cameras allow you to set minimum and maximums for your settings, so the camera doesn't pick something that doesn't work for you. So you can set the minimum shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, or maybe the maximum aperture at f16, or the maximum ISO at 6400. Know your limits as per your style and tastes and program them in. And finally, what the heck do I do if both the shutter speed and aperture are critical to the shot, and you don't want to leave those to chance, but you're shooting in busy action and changing light. Manual with auto ISO to the rescue. You set the shutter speed to freeze or blur the action as needed. You set the aperture to make the background blurry or in focus, and just let the camera pick the ISO to balance the exposure. Set the maximum ISO you're comfortable with, and you're off to the races. And you know what? I shoot in this mode all the time. I like fast shutter speeds to freeze wildlife movement, and I like a blurry background. These two settings control the creative elements of my photo, and are the critical ones I want to control. But I don't care what the ISO is in my photos. ISO 100, 400, 800, 1600, I don't care. My image quality might be affected, but not the creative aspects of my photography. And the camera can change these settings much faster than I can in the field and in changing light. Excellent. And remember, there's no real or right mode on a camera. You use the one that's right for you. Let me know in the comments below what your choice is. If you'd like to know more about shooting in manual with auto ISO, I have a whole video on it, right here. If this video was deserving, give it a like and YouTube will share it with other aspiring photographers, helping them get to the next level in their photography. And I hope that you can use these tips to go out there and shoot in a new mode and get your own unique and amazing photos. I know you can do it.